Hello, and welcome to this webinar on Data is the Heart of the Golden Triangle. So, shouldn't we use it to inform controls? I'm Jack Poller, Senior Analyst in Data Security for Enterprise Strategy Group. Joining me today is Weil from Cyera. Ari, can you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Weil. I am the head of marketing and go-to-market strategy for Cyera, and I'm really excited to be presenting with Jack today.
Thank you, Ari. And I thought what we'd first do is let's sort of talk about what is the Golden Triangle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people look at the Golden Triangle in different ways, but essentially it's putting together three things that are critical for any sort of a cybersecurity operation to be successful. And that's a combination of people, process, and technology. And oftentimes, when you look at a diagram of the Golden Triangle, you'll see each of them represented as one of the sides with data in the center, because that's really, at the end of the day, what your crown jewels or your most highly prized possessions are as an organization. In fact, if you think about it, a lot of organizations would consider that their intellectual property makes up about 70% of the value of the data that they manage. And so when you think about the importance of a cybersecurity strategy and the people, processes, and technology that safeguard that data, I think it puts into perspective just how really valuable and critical it is.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is some of the things that are changing in the world of data today. So I'm going to start with talking about some research that we've done recently, looking at what's happening. And really, the big thing that we're seeing today is a shift of data to the public cloud. So currently today, only 7% of organizations have more than 50% of their data stored in the cloud. In 24 months from now, those organizations tell us they'll have more than 30% of organizations will have more than half of their data in the cloud. So there's a big shift. And equally important with that, or even more important, is the amount of sensitive data. What do we think about as sensitive data? And today, only 6% of organizations have more than half of their data in the cloud would be considered sensitive. And 24 months from now, it'll be 20% of organizations will have more than half of their data in the cloud be considered sensitive. So we're seeing this big shift. I'm wondering if you're seeing that and how that sort of affects things for you.
Yeah, we absolutely see that with our customers. And one of the main things that we hear is, as we try to adopt new cloud technologies, new ways of leveraging cloud technologies, and all of the impacts that it has to our Golden Triangle, how do we actually adapt the skills that our people have, hire in the right people, retain the people with the sorts of skills and institutional knowledge that are required to both develop our applications, but also safeguard them as they evolve? How do we learn about the right technologies to be putting in place, both to leverage the cloud effectively, to manage our spend, to manage consumption, utilization, and uptime, but then also, again, to layer in the appropriate security controls? And then when you think about the processes that sort of knit those together, how do things like application development and deployment change? So oftentimes there will be a commensurate shift in the architecture of your application. Maybe you'll move from a waterfall development model to a microservices architecture with more of an agile methodology, so that you can get incremental updates to your application published faster, so you can leverage automation and scripting more effectively, building in unit testing and system testing, and all sorts of observability along that life cycle of development of your applications. And then also thinking about, from a security practitioner's perspective, there was a way that I used to understand all of the data that I managed. I used to know where it was. I used to know what sorts of applications and workloads would require that data and where it would be flowing, who should have access to it. With the cloud, because of the pace of innovation, because of the scale of deployments, and the ease of which development teams, product teams, business units can deploy new value propositions to capture or create value for the organization, security teams are left catching up, trying to understand those really basic tenets of: what data do I have, where is it located, how is it being managed, and who has access, so that they can put the right controls in place. So it really is a shift across every axis of that triangle.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that I really want to emphasize is that you touched on a little bit, and I know we'll dive into this a little bit later, but it's really the understanding of we no longer can keep in our heads where the data is and what it is, right? The on-premises infrastructure, you could talk to your IT team and your cybersecurity team, and they could say, I can point right there, and I know that there's a stack of disk drives that has all of my data. There's got 4 databases, 17 servers, and I know everything that's going about it. And if it's a little bit more complicated than that, maybe I keep track of it in an Excel spreadsheet, right? And once we shift to the cloud, we have sort of multiple dynamic things going on. One is we have data split across infrastructure as a service type cloud environments, as well as software as a service type cloud environments. The other sort of dynamic is that so much of our data is created and manipulated programmatically rather than with the human interaction. So it's very easy to, through a program, generate tons of data, make a clone of a database, copy it, move it around. It moves very, very quickly, and it multiplies at speeds beyond what we can comprehend, right? And I think
Absolutely.
that really impacts the how we think about it and the tools we need and what the tools need to be able to do and how they operate. And you talked about process, and I think one of the things you didn't talk about, and I wanted to share this piece of data, is let's look at the impact from a regulatory point of view, right? And one of the things we see is that the cloud makes cloud resident data makes regulatory compliance more difficult, right? And there's a whole bunch of things, but really general data protection regulation, right? The European Union's massive data privacy requirements and regulations are much more difficult to comply with because we don't know where that data is, we don't know what it is, and we don't know when and where it was created and how fast it was created. It also affects cybersecurity insurance, right? And so what we see is that organizations are struggling to get cybersecurity insurance, and the insurance people are making cybersecurity controls a requirement in order to get to get your insurance. So all of the cloud making this more difficult has a huge impact. So let's talk a little bit more. So that's sort of one part of the process. What other sort of process things do you see?
Well, I think it's really interesting. If we think about another stat, one that gets bandied about quite a lot is that 90% of the world's data has been created over the last 2 years. And if you think about what we're talking about here, we're talking about sensitive data. So it is a subset of that overall data volume. We're not talking about literally all of the exabytes of data that are being created right now, but we are talking about a material amount of information that companies have to safeguard. Now, procedurally, to your point, there are certain things that our adoption of cloud technology have changed for the enterprise, but not necessarily changed across every function or every interaction between functions. So think about, for example, moving from a waterfall development model to more of an agile model, or moving from a monolithic application to microservices. One technology that knits together these microservices and cloud architectures is a message queuing service. If you've got some element of your application stack that is creating data and another that has to consume that data in order to perform its function, that could be a currency conversion utility. It could be somebody placing an order in an e-commerce website or booking a flight or a hotel for a travel and hospitality website. It could even have to do with clinical trials for pharmaceuticals, where you have people who are actually inputting their data, or technicians who are inputting the results of a test, and then this commensurate action that has to occur. When people create something like a message queue that will extract, transform, and load data to provide it to another service, are they thinking about doing that in a way that is compliant with regulations like GDPR, which you mentioned? Because if they are, then that means that you've got to have region-specific, and in some cases, country-specific message queues and ETL processes. And a lot of businesses haven't done that yet, because theoretically, they could centralize that part of their architecture and just have a central broker where all the data would come in, the decisions would be made, and then it would flow out to the systems where it needed to be stored. But nowadays, that's not really okay anymore. That is out of compliance with privacy statutes like GDPR. And it's not the only one, but it is the most storied, the most famous.
Right.
You mentioned something else where you think about how this has to do with cybersecurity regulations. If you consider the fact that you have to, as an organization, as a security practitioner within an organization, help the business comply with a security a cybersecurity insurance provider's request, you have to estimate the amount of data that you manage. Now, if you have software supply chains that maybe when you pull the latest version of the software have implemented new technology and are either creating additional data or storing additional data elsewhere in your organization, it could be duplicative from your perspective, but maybe for their infrastructure, they're using it for a separate purpose. And then you also have people inside of your organization who are starting to create new value streams, maybe with that same data, but spinning it up in an alternative data store. You're now expanding the amount of data that you manage. And if you're unaware of that, and then you report to the insurance company that you're managing a certain amount of data, and then heaven forbid you actually have to make a claim because you were impacted by ransomware or malware that would require insurance relief, and you're drastically out of compliance with the amount that you estimated, these are concerns that are really keeping security practitioners up at night. In fact, when Cyera recently commissioned a survey ourselves, and we talked to over 250 directors and above of security in the US and Canada, they told us that cybersecurity insurance premiums were one of the things that concerned them as far as an exposure point that they had in their business. There was a lot of understanding of privacy regulations, a lot less understanding about how to estimate the amount of data that they were managing for reporting to insurance agencies.
Yeah, and that's, we think about that and it's just insurance, but when you lose your sensitive data, it goes, we think about all of the typical things that happen, right? You get reputational risk, right? You lose money, right? All of those types of things. For some organizations, losing their intellectual property or losing their privacy data, that's an existential risk to the company. The company could cease to exist if they lose that data, right? And so it goes beyond just, insurance and dollars and cents types things. These are serious considerations that we have to think about. And, as we were talking about, it's harder and harder because the data is being created and moving so fast in the cloud. Right now, I thought, sort of let's jump a little bit because you talked about a little bit about people, and let's talk about some of the people involved. So we did in our research, and I'll bring this up right now. We looked at who is responsible for defining your data security policies. And we've seen over the last couple of years this emergence of cloud security architects. And they're really sort of the primary people responsible for defining your security policies for data in the cloud. But there's a whole bunch of other people involved. You have your typical IT data center team. You have your cybersecurity team. If you have a DevOps environment, the DevOps team is involved, the networking team. And then, of course, we can't forget the regulatory compliance team that we're talking about just a minute ago. And then you also have legal and your line of business and application owners. And I want to come back
Jack, really quickly,
sure.
you're sharing the presenter's view. So maybe just if you could switch that so we see the slide larger. But you're 100% spot on about the distributed ownership of the data across the organization. And it's actually one of those things that makes it really challenging for the process piece to really work together with the people, right? Like you've got cloud security architects that are responsible for giving their input and their guidance on creating policies. Now they have to work with the compliance team, the legal team. They're going to have to work with people who are advising from an external perspective as well in many cases, and then also bring in the business units. And it's one of those things that you and I have had numerous conversations about, but we've also spoken with a lot of our customers at Cyera as well, which is to say that the people inside of an organization that have input into this process are many. The people who own the process or feel a sense of ownership over the entirety of the process of understanding what data you have and how you should be managing it and what rules and stipulations should be put in place, that's a little bit more elusive because the question is to what end? So if you think about a cybersecurity team and the office of the chief security officer or chief information security officer, there's a very clear remit there. You're supposed to build a culture of security awareness. You're supposed to make sure that the company is kept secure and resilient from breaches and theft. And then you're also supposed to be architecting for the future so that you establish basically a robust architecture and set of processes for driving a security culture in the organization. Now, if you look at it from a business unit's perspective, it's very different. You're there to generate revenue, to establish and maintain trust with customers, and to ultimately maintain the highest possible lifetime value for all of the customers of your organization. And then if you think about the global risk and compliance team or people who get involved with privacy, they really are the interface that is responsible for and think about every day how to comply with regulations. And oftentimes those three groups, and they're not the only three groups, but they're the ones that most often are discussed when we talk about cybersecurity, can be at odds. Because if the business unit needs to go faster and they need to be agile and need to have the ability to experiment and go fast and break things and hopefully fail fast and learn from what they've done, that has its own set of metrics that, time to value is certainly chief among those considerations. The ability to iterate and deploy more versions of the application to drive up daily or weekly average use of your product, to be able to have a higher customer base, a larger customer base, to extract value from that customer base. That's a set of metrics. And then if you think about privacy, it's complying with audits. It's making sure that the company doesn't realize fines from the timeliness of complying with audits or the completeness with which they comply with an audit, or that they're not found in breach of a given audit or a statute. And then the security team sort of has to catch and save around the sides, which is an increasingly challenging proposition, especially when you consider the fact that they're not really in the loop in most of the conversations around how the business is developing either its policies or its go-to-market approach. But they are expected to be there to provide the safeguards that are required as long as it doesn't disrupt the business.
I think that's a really important point that I sort of want to stress even further, is that the compliance team has a very easy job in one sense, because what they're protecting is well defined, right? The regulations say this is what your personal information is, so this is what your PHI, your private health information is. When we do these research, and I talk about this research into data security a lot, and I use the term sensitive information, people often ask me, well, how did you define sensitive information? And my answer always is, I don't define sensitive information, right? Every organization's definition of sensitive information is different. And, you and I are talking about a lot of these issues from the perspective of the cybersecurity team and the cybersecurity controls, where we can put controls in place to protect sensitive information. But very often we need the line of business owners and the legal teams to define what it is the organization cares about, what sensitive information is, whether it's the intellectual property or the accounting information or design stuff, right? All of it could or could not be sensitive depending on your perspective and what's important to your business, right?
Completely agree. Yeah. And I think what you saw, and you've got some data on this as well, that's looking at the rise in one particular group, which is the cloud security architect group within an organization. And I think that, to me, especially as a person working in an organization that really focuses on data security apart from cloud security, is the interplay between the people who really understand and need to protect data and the people who need to really understand and protect your cloud infrastructure, your cloud workloads, because they're related, but again, very sort of different approaches to solving interconnected problems, right? If I look at the cloud security architect, that person or that team needs to really be focused on, where am I using cloud infrastructure today? What are the different components? How does my responsibility lie in the whole shared responsibility model with the cloud solutions provider? But to the point where I'm focused, it's where my data resides. It's not necessarily the data. So if I think about it, I'm going to care about configurations. I'm going to care about things like, are my data stores patched? Am I doing some of the security best practices around object storage or file level storage? But what's missing in that equation is the notion of, what does my data actually represent? And how do I nuance? How do I apply context to really know, should this S3 bucket actually be exposed to the public internet or not? Well, that really depends on the data that's inside of that bucket. But that's not necessarily my remit as a cloud security architect. Now, the tools, when we talk about that golden triangle still, where we have people and technology working together, there are certain tools like cloud native application protection platforms that are starting to add some rudimentary data awareness to their platforms. And some of them have been added for a number of years, but it's not core to that platform. It's another element of it. And that's usually why when we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about defense in depth, because you do need to layer controls in order to have all of that context and all of that nuance represented, to effectively have the right context to apply the right controls at the right time. And that's something that the growth in a cloud security architect is a great leading indicator of awareness and really investment in that area. But now we need to really think about, okay, how does that person or that team start to interact with the folks who actually understand the data that is being managed in that environment? And they're a nuanced set of challenges, but they're very important nuances.
Right. So I just, and I apologize for bringing this up early, but let's sort of just really quickly talk about this research, which also brings up something else. So this is really looking at organizations that have a cloud security architect. So what we see now this year is that roughly 60% of organizations have had a cloud security architect in place for at least a year, and another 27% have recently established the position. So 86% of organizations have a cloud security architect in place. In 2018, when we asked that question, we only saw 48% of organizations had this position or type of position in place. So it's really growing in importance, but it also highlights something else, which is we have a perennial and a long-term shortage of cybersecurity skills, right? So in general, when we look at and say, where do you have skill shortages? 45% of organizations tell us they have a cybersecurity skill shortage. Now, we've been doing this, asking this very same question for roughly 15 years, and the answer has been the same. Cybersecurity always ranks up at the top, and it's anywhere between 45 and 50% of people organizations can't find the people that have the skills they need. Now, if you look at the next cloud ones, it's IT architecture, IT orchestration and automation, and cloud architecture. Right. So everything having to do with IT and cybersecurity is in high demand, and we don't have the people necessary to do that, to really think about and run these things. So part of that sort of leads into sort of technology as sort of that next part of the golden triangle. And what are some of the technology things we have to think about and consider? So I'll start with, again, and I should have just left my research up here. I'll start with this research of what's data-related tasks are the most difficult that we have. And we talked about regulatory compliance. Now, the numbers here look a little bit strange. You only see 13, 11, and 11. So this was a ranking question where we asked people to rank these set of objects, these set of tasks as most difficult to least difficult. So 13% of organizations said regulatory compliance was their number one most difficult thing. 11% said determining risk associated with sensitive data was their most difficult challenge, tied with data governance. Right. So these are all the issues we've been talking about, and really determining the risk associated with sensitive data is a challenge because we don't necessarily understand what that data is. Right.
Yep. And that's a really interesting challenge, because when you think about what goes into the top three things that you showed there. So if you think about regulatory compliance as an example, you can use a very common use case for a publicly traded company: earnings. So in the case of earnings, you have a certain date that you say to the public investment community, this is when I'm going to report my quarterly or my annual performance from a revenue perspective. And that's when, the CEO typically and the CFO will get on and they'll talk about the growth of the company and their cost of goods sold and all of the other financial metrics that go into either making or breaking a quarter, or, beating or meeting expectations. There's a temporal element to when that data is sensitive. So before earnings, it is tightly regulated. The FCC wants to know that you are not disclosing any information in advance of earnings, so that you might impact people's investment decisions based on where your stock might go up or down in line with your earnings announcement. The moment you're public with that data, the sensitivity of the information is completely different. And there's an example of a dynamic security control that is actually really difficult to achieve. Because if you think about the way that the average data discovery and classification technology has been architected historically, it was historically intended to really be there for data that was mostly managed at rest. It was fairly static in nature, and you understood where it was at all times. It was in a managed data center. It might even have been on your own property. You understood the number of data stores that were deployed because there was a an infrastructure investment there. There was an electricity and a cooling investment there. People had an IT infrastructure and asset management catalog that was kept up to date in line with when you purchased and deployed any given piece of hardware or software. In the cloud, it's completely different. Now you're deploying software all the time. You're leveraging existing infrastructure, investments that the cloud providers have made. Maybe, and oftentimes you're even deploying things on SaaS platforms where you don't even have a view of the infrastructure at all. You're just consuming the benefits of the service. And now you've got to start thinking about, how can I get from very static point in time understandings where I could do a data risk assessment maybe once a quarter, I understand what I have, I understand what's at risk, to now things are changing even hourly during the day, using that very common and maybe not 100% applicable earnings example.
Right.
But if you think about something that's a little bit closer to home, just imagine an individual customer's right to be forgotten request. On the other end of the spectrum, that is almost by definition a dynamic security control, because somebody can tell you at any given point in time, tell me all of the data that you have about me, tell me how you've been managing and using it, and then tell me if I want to be forgotten by your company, that you can guarantee that you knew where all of my data was, how you were using it, who had access to it, and that you can eliminate any record of me from your databases. That sort of, to me, is the extreme end of a dynamic security control, where you need to understand all of the elements of your data and then to be able to take action on them with certainty and assure somebody externally that you have taken that action. And then you have to comply with the individual's privacy
Right.
expectation, which is totally reasonable, as well as several governing bodies from a privacy perspective, expectations of you as a business as well.
So let's talk about our ability to discover all of that data that we're talking about, right? So we looked at that and we asked organizations, how confident are you in your ability to discover all of your data in the cloud? And the answer is pretty confident. Our organizations say 45% of organizations say they're completely confident. 48% of organizations say they're mostly confident. When we asked organizations, well, where did you lose cloud data from? How did you lose it? 19% say they've lost data due to undiscovered shadow data, data that they found in a data breach somehow, but they originally didn't know they had or didn't know where it was. So we really struggle with that, and we think we know where all of our data is, but we really don't, right?
So let's talk about that term discover, because I think it's a really interesting and nuanced term, and it shouldn't be, because discovery implies, especially when you talk about technology that purports to discover data, that it will do the discovery for you. But more often than not, discovery means that the solution can discover when you point it to your data. So if you think about the way that the average data loss prevention system works, you will understand where your data is. You will then manually connect that technology to the data, either using an ODBC or a JDBC connector. Maybe you'll use some sort of an agent or a network proxy, but you will tell the solution, this is where my data is. I've now discovered it for you, and you know where that is. Now, what are some of the gaps in that sort of an approach? Well, first of all, if you think about how quickly businesses can deploy new data stores, there's a new include from a JavaScript perspective that could create a new data store, create a new NoSQL database, for example, for a web application that is now collecting some information about you. A marketer can add a piece of JavaScript to their website to start to collect information for A/B testing or personalization data that the security team may not know about, and the marketer may not know that they have to make the security team aware of. You can also get inside of your software supply chain new data stores that you're managing getting created when you just download the latest patch or update to an existing piece of software that you've used. But in all of those cases, those are sort of the incidental things that happen purely from a technology perspective. If you think procedurally within an organization, you've also got analysts who will say, I need access to information about how people are engaging with us as a company so that we can start to forecast and plan the next strategic investment area for our business that has the highest propensity for growth. You should, in theory, be taking the data from production. You should be transforming it or masking it or otherwise tokenizing it so you eliminate anything personally identifiable or any trade secrets that are not part of the analysis, and then put that into a data lake. But it's just one of those things, whether it's a DBA that was crushed for time, whether it was somebody who just said, I don't know what you need to use or what you don't need to use, but here you go. I believe that you'll have, for example, dynamic data masking employed in your data lake. And so this sensitive data won't be visible to people who shouldn't see it. But that data will make it into environments that you don't expect it to. It's the same thing with developers who'll say that in order to develop the next version of my application, I need something that looks like production data. Well, that's true, but you don't need social security numbers. You don't need real email addresses. You don't need other sensitive data that a customer would provide to you just to understand the shape and the sort of real representation of data. It doesn't have to be the real data. And there are a number of technologies that can do privacy preserving encryption. There are things that can do tokenization, but still maintain whatever a developer would need to do data checking or validity checking inside of an application before they were to capture inbound data that somebody would provide. It's just that those steps tend to be missed, either because people aren't aware that they should be applying these controls, or because they don't necessarily know how to operate the tools that are in place, or because when it comes to discovery, there might have been a tool where you didn't manually discover that this was a data store with sensitive data, and then you didn't have that tagged or marked accordingly. And so the people who were managing the flow of information didn't know. And this does dovetail into another topic, which is classification. But that discovery piece has just become so challenging inside of an organization simply because data is evolving so quickly.
Yeah, and one of the other drivers that you mentioned, I think, is very important, because we see this in a lot of areas of IT, is that IT and cybersecurity teams don't want to be responsible for somebody not being able to do their job. So it's much easier to give people more data than they request and more access than they should have, rather in order to make sure that you are not a roadblock in their job, right? And that goes back to also that sort of that next topic of classification, is understanding what is sensitive and what is not. And that's not necessarily an IT or cybersecurity person's role, as we talked about earlier. So when we asked organizations, again, how confident are you in your ability to classify your data as sensitive or not, or what type of data it is, whether it's PII or PHI or a credit card, 48% said they're completely confident, and 44% said they're mostly confident. However, a third, 33%, have lost data due to misclassification, which is a huge amount of data that is getting misclassified, and worse than just getting misclassified, getting exposed.
Good. I mean, it's something that we see every day. It's something that if you were to just set up a basic Google search and have it notify you on a daily basis of the times that you'll see data breach come up in a news story, you might, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised by how many hits you would get on a daily basis. But let's think about this in pieces. First of all, there's the self-attestation, self-reporting of, I know about this data, it's mine, I own it, and I am going to label it accordingly. Now, first of all, you have to know that you should be doing that. Second, you need to know how to do that. And then the third thing is you have to be reminded or somehow alerted to the fact that if that changes over time, that you will go in and change that representation. Now, in general cloud environments, there are cloud tags, which are pretty freeform, but you can add data sensitivity to those. In Microsoft environments, especially Microsoft 365, they actually have a Microsoft Information Protection Sensitivity label, MIP labels, that are specifically designed for data loss prevention and governance tools to function correctly by identifying the sensitivity level of data. Now, the challenge with that is the normal evolution of data in the enterprise. I will create, as a developer, let's say, an application where my marketing team says, I need these PDFs to be available to anybody who comes to the site, because they need to understand, let's say if I'm a consumer banking application, what sort of financial products I have available. I don't need to be collecting somebody's information. I want it to be as easy as possible for them to get their hands on this information. And so it would be normal to put it in an S3 bucket in AWS, to have that completely open to the public internet, and to have the application not require any authentication, just grab those assets whenever somebody wants to download them.
Right.
Awesome. Now, let's say that the same consumer now has a login to that platform, and the developer says, hey, I have an S3 bucket sitting here. If I create a financial vehicle specifically for this customer, I can just store it in that same S3 bucket. Well, if they do that and they don't change the sensitivity label of the bucket, or think that they should have maybe two buckets and then update their application architecture so that one has public data and another one has private data, then you start to create this problem where the initial definition and the initial metadata classification of this bucket was accurate. But then over time it changed. And then if you don't go in and change the label, your existing tools that didn't know how to discover your data in the first place wouldn't know that anything's amiss because you've already connected it to this S3 bucket. It had a label and that's what they understand. Don't automatically classify either. And classification gets really challenging. And the reason for that is it's not just the tag that tells you what data is inside of something. You need to understand also what type of data it is. And typically people would use regular expressions and sample data or object definitions to inform or to train a model to say, this is the sort of data that we expect to be here. And that has its own set of benefits, but also limitations, because there's a number of different ways that you can enter in a social security number or a credit card number or an email address. But those are three of the most common and most readily defined types of sensitive data in an organization. Imagine if you have something truly proprietary, like the way that you would create the recipes for a pharmaceutical, the way that you would store all of the results of a clinical trial, or maybe it's your intellectual property as a technology manufacturer. Maybe it could be a schematic for your next chip design that you would have stored. That's really challenging to define with a regular expression or just simple object data, especially in the legacy world where the DLP solutions and other data security tools need that definition to be provided to them because they don't classify, they allow you to store a classification. And that sort of brings me to the third level where you get increasingly complicated, which is the nuance then of the sensitivity of the data based on not just, is this a birthday, is this a email address, is this somebody's home address, but then is this person a minor? Are they a customer? Are they an employee? Are they an applicant who was never accepted as an employee? Because that nuance of the role that somebody plays in your organization, the location where they are that makes them fall under different privacy statutes or data governance regulations. And then thinking about the sensitivity of the data individually and in combination means that now you might be confident that you have something that could classify. And in your mind, you're thinking, I have MIP sensitivity labels in my Microsoft 365 environment. But what those people who belie the sort of confidence with the percentage of people who have actually experienced a breach oftentimes miss is it's a moving target. It's a changing and a dynamic problem. And it's also one where there are different levels of understanding and classification that you really have to achieve. And I think that's part of the problem with the nomenclature, is that discovery and classification used to mean a point in time understanding of the rudimentary elements of data. Now in the cloud environment, where things like generative AI and the way that people are using SaaS platforms and the way that data is constantly evolving have changed the game, is you now have to really understand context and nuance of data on a continuous basis. And if you're not using a tool or investing in technology that is going to be providing you automation and time to value, continuous scanning, and use a combination of regular expressions, machine learning, and large language models to really understand your data, then you're leaving yourself exposed. And granted, it is sort of late breaking technology that's providing this value, but it's technology that's available and that, I think practitioners really need to understand better by giving it a try or talking to people who have been using it and understand the difference between the sort of legacy approach built for on-prem infrastructure and these new models that have come out in the last 2 years with DSPM and some of the data detection and response technologies of the cloud native data security platforms that are really helping you keep pace with the cloud and AI.
Yeah, and one thing I think you brought up that I don't think a lot of people recognize is we often think about this distinction between on-premises infrastructure and the cloud infrastructure, and that makes a huge difference. But one of the subtle things difference that it makes is the dynamic nature. And all of the legacy tools were built around not just the infrastructure being static, but the data being relatively static. And well defined, right? If you had a database, you had a column that said this was a social security number, and you could just say, okay, I can protect that column because I know it's a social security number. I don't necessarily need to search on text fields for that, right? Just random text fields. Today, our data is encoded. The same data is encoded in many different ways. You can have it in an XML format of some form or another, or a database, or an image file could also contain a lot of that sensitive data. And that understanding of the fact that it changes over time, and in fact, not just over time, thinking about long scale time, but over hours, minutes, even seconds, as with the volume of transactions that organizations do. So it's a very dynamic environment today where it didn't used to be.
Well, and I think it's also true if you consider the fact that most organizations are going to use 10 plus clouds in their average, infrastructure deployment. And that could be, AWS, Azure, GCP, but it would also include things like Databricks or MongoDB Atlas or Snowflake for data lakes. You would be using things like Salesforce and Slack and other sorts of technologies from a SaaS perspective, not to mention Google Productivity Suite or the Microsoft 365, tools like SharePoint Online and OneDrive and things of that nature. Your data is making it to all these different places that are in the cloud. And it is your responsibility, according to the shared responsibility model, to manage this data. But if you think about it, where we've been talking about individual roles and ownership as just even silos of understanding and visibility because of the tooling that's been available, a lot of people will use a cloud native application protection platform and think about, I know that I have secured my cloud infrastructure. And that's great. But you'll have people who have legitimate need and a business reason to access data in that environment. Now, how do you know if that person is taking that information and putting it in a data lake that is outside of the purview currently of a CNAP platform in a way that is in line with regulations, or that they're not exporting it from that cloud environment like AWS or GCP and then putting it into a CSV file or some other object that's now being managed in a Microsoft 365 environment, maybe with global access, maybe with anybody in the public internet who has access to this link can see the data, because you're losing that visibility as soon as you move outside of that deployment model. And so I think that you add one more axis of complexity to this challenge, where it's not just that your data is evolving, it's also that the way that you're leveraging the cloud is continuously evolving. And you have to enable this shifting architecture based on the way that the average enterprise works today. I mean, the pandemic accelerated work from home, work from anywhere, bring your own device, the use of SaaS collaboration platforms. It's also made it, though, so that people are coming and going from organizations a lot faster than they ever used to before. And when you put all of that together with the changing nature of the sensitivity of data, with the changing architectures that are so easy to modify and evolve in the cloud, now you've really got to work across all three axes of the golden triangle, but with that continuous and dynamic visibility of the data so that you can really address it across all three axes. And that would be, upskilling and training your employees, but also developing a culture of communication and education around data and regulations. It would be making sure that you're kept abreast of the latest technology that's available for your teams to be the most successful. And then it's evolving your processes as those regulations change, as new technology becomes available, and frankly, as your applications and your business continuously evolves to take advantage of the changing conditions on the internet and in the cloud.
Absolutely. And I think, I was going to ask you to sum up, but I think you've done a great job of summing up that, we're talking about the golden triangle, about, people, process, technology, and data is at the core of it. And our data and the nature, our data is changing, and how we store it is changing. It lives in the cloud now instead of on premises. How we're using it is changing. And it's, I think, a very quick summary was we've turned the volume up to 11, right? The speed has gone up, the velocity has gone up, the variety has gone up. Everything is moving faster and bigger and better. And so data security needs to keep up with that.
I think that sums it up really well, Jack. Thank you so much for the discussion.
Well, thank you. It's been great. And hopefully everybody else listening has found this as interesting as I have. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.